Welcome to HortTube. My name is Jim Putnam. This is the garden question and answer video that I do pretty much every Sunday. You can ask gardening questions down in the comment section below the video. That's where we pick the questions from each week. I think we wrote down about 25 this week. And again, I try to get ones that are kind of relevant to whatever's going on at that time, or ones I haven't answered in a while, or ones I'm just getting over and over and over again that I feel like I need, that I should answer. A few things before we jump into questions. One, the Learn to Garden video series is $60 off for the month of May, and it's already had 2 videos go up here in May. One on transplanting, and then the second one that I put up is on using, I talk about why plants are more vulnerable to insects and how I go about measuring the sugars out here in the garden with a refractometer. Not a tool that you need to buy, but I just go over the actual reasons that plants are vulnerable, more or less vulnerable to insect problems in the garden, and you know how that takes a bit of time. It's just not something I've actually covered over here on the main channel, and it's now on the Learn to Garden video series. I think it's about a 14-minute video, but that makes, I don't know how many videos now are on the over there, but it's probably coming up on 30 something. It might be coming up on 40 videos on the Learn to Garden video series. And so anyway, it's $60 off this month. It's over on the HortTube.com website. Thanks for considering it. And thanks to those of you who have actually already bought it. I also talk about raised beds being an issue in that video, about the availability of minerals that you get from the soil versus in raised beds, and how that can make your plants more vulnerable as well. So anyway, that's in that video. The videos that went up this week, I think there was one here in the garden in Raleigh, but then we went up to Charlotte on Monday and filmed actually 3 videos up there, 2 with Jay Sifford, one at, or both of them at a garden that he designed and installed in Charlotte. One you will have already seen, it's the tour video, and then another one where we just point out some of the more interesting plants in the garden. That'll be up this next week. And then there should have been a video at Maple Walk as well from a Charlotte tour that we did as well. And then now you're watching the question and answer. So that's the 4 videos from this week. Okay, let's jump into some questions. Are you planning on labeling the plants for your open garden day? So yes, on June 22nd, we're gonna have the garden open here. It sounds like I'm going to have a lot of people here. We're gonna be open from 8 to 3. There was going to be some giveaways. I've got Soil Cube has given us some small bags of compost to give out. We've got Pro Pluggers giving us some stuff. Plants are being mailed from various locations. We're gonna have some giveaways. Then we'll have our t-shirts here available for sale, and there's 3 more designed t-shirts coming. I hope by that time. I'm still working on finalizing that, and one that has a silhouette of holly. She's back here. A silhouette of holly on the t-shirt. So, but what was the question? Oh yeah, are we labeling the plants? Yes, there'll be a lot of the plants here will have little labels hanging off of them. It's not the most decorative thing, but they will have some. We will have some things labeled here in the garden, so that some of your questions can be answered. Some of your questions will be answered for you. Hopefully, I'll have some of the other projects accomplished at that point as well. But the garden is looking. It's looking pretty good right now. You get this period of time where you're in between the spring flowers and the summer flowers, and that's kind of where we are. But well, gardenias are starting to bloom. I got a gardenia back there blooming. Got a hydrangea back there blooming. Acanthus back in the background. The rest of what you're seeing here, though, is really being done with foliage. There's some dianthus blooming, but for the most part, this garden right now is not about flowers. It's about texture and the color of the foliage and that kind of thing. Okay, so that's a yes on the will things be tagged. What are your strategies? What are my strategies if an insect or a fungal problem become too much of a problem? I pull it out and get rid of it. Normally, there's moving it, and assuming that something is going on with it. And I discussed in that video that I put on the Learn to Garden video series, if I take this gardenia, there's a gardenia back here that's in bloom, has no issues whatsoever. If I take that plant and I dig it up and I put it in a container and I put it inside the house, it will almost immediately get mites, white flies, one of the big issues that gardenias get. The reason for that is it doesn't have the light it needs inside the house. It lacks humidity. Maybe the soil mix isn't acidic enough. Whatever it is, it's going to deny that plant something and make it more vulnerable for those types of problems. So one of the first strategies you can use is to transplant something and assume that it may be in a spot that's too wet or too dry or too windy or whatever the heck it is, right? Whatever the heck it is that's causing the problem. So one of the first strategies is to move it. And then after that, it's to make it go away. I mean, not every plant will perform well in every space that we try to put them in. There's going to be something that's not going to go well, or perennial that doesn't come back every year in some spot in your garden or something. You're going to find something that isn't going to always go all that well. And some of the named varieties of plants out in the world aren't necessarily the strongest things in the world. They were sometimes just picked because they were super floriferous. They're super colorful, right, in the garden in some way. But then they find them just as overall kind of weak plants. The parent plant was a much stronger plant, although it wasn't as showy as the named variety. So there is that kind of stuff too. But I'd never let one plant out here bug me for very long before I either moved it or erased it from the garden. Okay, can Nellie Stevens be trimmed flat or limbed up if they are too large for an established landscape? Yeah, they can definitely be limbed up into trees. And we showed some right over here on the road that's runs horizontal over here to us. One of the walking around the neighborhood tours, we showed a big row of Nellie Stevens hollies, and those have kind of just naturally limbed themselves up. I can now see right through the bottom of them. But you can absolutely limb Nellie Stevens up into small trees or shear the sides on them. They're shearing the sides on those and they're limbing themselves up, and they look fine. And you're not going to hurt them, established ones. But Nellie does tend to try to get too broad at the base sometimes, depending on the size lot you have. But they can absolutely be sheared on the side or limbed up. What happens if you don't trim back your ornamental grasses? Somebody else answered it. Eventually, all that material will just kind of blow around and blow away. Nothing happens. Your grasses will still come back. Keep in mind, that's how the grasses are in the wild. There's nobody going out into the grassy plains of the world and cutting all the grasses back at the end of winter. They just don't, in our tidy ornamental gardens that people try to keep, it doesn't look as tidy as it would if you had cut them back and had gotten rid of the material. But I almost guarantee that some of that dead grass material that's down in your grasses is probably going to be used by birds to line their nest. It's probably going to be useful. It's going to be, and eventually it's just going to kind of blow off the plant and look normal anyway. But it's completely and totally normal for a grass to have to grow up through its the foliage that died back the previous year. It's not going to hurt them to have to do that. Okay. So somebody said, can you get t-shirts sent to Ireland, Canada, other places? If you just send me an email to the HortTube@gmail.com address, I'll get a price to find out. I'm not going to try to make a profit on it. I just find out how much it is to send you one to Ireland, and we can just do that. Hold on. Person doesn't want to fertilize much or apply pesticides. Are blueberries easy to grow? Yeah, blueberries are easy to grow as long as your soil is acidic. You have a low pH, a low soil pH. They prefer a pH like 5, really, really low pH. If your pH is neutral or higher, sometimes they can be iron deficient, and then you end up going down a rabbit hole of needing to add sulfur to lower the pH so that the iron that's in the soil already is available to them, and you're in a you start something you can't stop in order to grow them. So for me, if you're the soil pH in this garden is like 5.8. They'd like it a little bit lower than that, but 5.8 is totally adequate for them to get the iron that they need. And so my 4 blueberries down the driveway look great down there. So test your soil pH. If it's low, You know, if it's 5 point something, even low 6s would probably be fine. Then you don't have to, again, you're not gonna have to swim uphill in order to grow blueberries in those conditions. And yeah, they're pretty easy overall to grow. You got to protect them from the birds. I'm looking down the driveway right now at my 4, and there's lots of berries on them. We're going out there and just eating them right off the plant. And the birds are coming along and, you know, getting their share is as well. But overall, I consider blueberries very easy to grow. And fertilizing, we just fertilize once a year in February. Just to show you how little fertilizing I do, I could probably get away without fertilizing them. And it's another thing I've talked about, you know, in the Learn to Garden video series, and I reiterated in the weekly garden planner, and I can't, you know, I was putting up July is going up on the weekly garden planner. It's also $20 off, and there's a discount code down below the video of this video, and it's over on the website as well. But on the weekly garden planner, one of the videos that went up for July was just about the fact that everywhere you go, somebody's going to try to sell you fertilizer. They're going to try to sell it to you in bags, that, you know, potting mixes that all have fertilizer in them. It's almost hard to find a potting mix that doesn't have fertilizer in it now. You know, even if it's like October, should I be using fertilizer? Of course, you probably on most things you wouldn't want to be fertilizing in October, but everything just comes with fertilizer in it, or they're hawking fertilizer. So one of the videos was to be super careful not to be fertilizing these ornamentals. You know, this is May right this second, but you know, as I'm filming a July video, I want to make sure that folks aren't fertilizing these woody ornamentals in July, because even though they'll look good and you know, they'll be beautiful out here in the garden, when it's 90-some degrees outside, most of these shrubs are just in a kind of a holding pattern where they're not growing. They're just sitting here going, why is it so hot outside? You don't want to be throwing fertilizer at them at that moment, especially synthetic fertilizer that was designed to feed the plant directly and bypass the natural way that plants actually get fed by beneficial fungi, beneficial bacteria from under the ground. When you bypass that with a synthetic fertilizer and go directly to fertilize the plant, you're really pushing it at a time when it's under stress. So that was one of the videos on the July garden planner, which is be careful, you know, not to be oversold on fertilizer. And I don't know how I just took that road. Okay, so it was about fertilizing blueberries. But yes, I fertilized the blueberries back in late February when they were still dormant, right before they started blooming. And it was a light application, way less than the bag told me to, and I won't fertilize them again until then. And again, that video goes up every year just so I can talk about how little I actually want to fertilize. But it takes a minute. It takes 3 or 4 years to build your soil where your soil can actually feed these plants. So initially it just kind of feels like you should be fertilizing more. But really what you should be doing, in my opinion, is working on the soil. And the soil can eventually take care of these plants without trying to push them too hard with especially synthetic fertilizers. Okay, where our containers come from, and do we elevate them, put rocks under them? Pretty much all of our containers came from Michael Carr Designs, and his studio's down in Atlanta, and we visited it before and did a video with Michael Carr, maybe a couple videos at this point with Michael Carr. And he has luckily sent us a few of these containers up here. And yes, we try to elevate them. I don't have every container where it's going right this second because I'm working on the patio over here. And because of that, I haven't gone through and elevated them all. But yes, I would like to have feet underneath the containers so that there's air underneath them and the plants don't. Several things happen. Number one, sometimes the plants just will root directly in the ground and then the pot's just kind of locked in place. And it can plug up that drain hole down at the bottom. Then the other thing is, weirdly, disease issues can develop in the bottom of our containers, in the bottom third of the soil in our containers, that doesn't necessarily develop in our soil. That bottom third of the soil in the container typically stays very, very wet. And I got some squirrels back here racing one another. That soil at the bottom of that container stays very, very wet, and it can become a place for disease to really, to develop. And so that's another reason I want to elevate them off the ground. And the biggest reason, I think the biggest reason for elevating them off the ground is actually slugs, because underneath those containers, you're watering those containers all season, so that water's running out of the bottom of that pot and always keeping it moist under your containers. So if you want to know where your slugs are hiding in the garden, that's where they're hiding. It's another video that was on the July weekly garden planner that I'm in the currently editing. The month of July broken down into weeks. It was another video that's on there is about slugs. Okay, let's go. And on Michael Carr website, I think he has a locator where you can put in your zip code or something and then find out who locally near you sells Michael Carr designed containers. Okay, so if you cut back a rose to the ground, will you kill it? It depends on the rose. If your shrub roses, like knockout roses, other shrub roses that aren't grafted, you can cut them about as low as you want to go and they'll come back from that. But like grafted roses, you know, named old cultivars of roses, they're not going to, Holly. Did you let Holly in? She was standing right there at the door for a second. Holly. There she comes. There she comes. Yeah, she was standing at the door. I was about to go put her in. Okay. All right. She lasts outside shorter and shorter periods of time right now, unfortunately. But she has been in a lot of videos recently. Okay. So a lot of the other roses are grafted, so be careful. You know, look down at the bottom of your rose if it's some named, you know, most roses are grafted that aren't shrub roses. Don't cut down below the graft at all. Those you probably want to leave up a foot or so, 14 inches, something like that. And above, you know, leave some branching above the graft. You'll see a little nodule down toward the bottom of it where the graft is. The other question is, you know, if I cut roses back to the ground, I hope you know, if you have rose rosette or you have some sort of issue with your shrub roses, that's not curable. So I want to just throw that out there. It wasn't in the question, but you can't cure rose rosette. So if you're having some issue that's making you consider cutting them back to the ground, if it's rose rosette, they just need to go anyway. Okay. Is there a best time to mulch in regards to heat? Well, for the person mulching, it's definitely better in the winter or the early spring or middle to late fall for sure, right? So that's for the person mulching. But for your plants, I do say frequently be careful mulching in the absolute peak heat of the summer. When that mulch hits your driveway, you know, you order a load of mulch and it hits your driveway, or even in bags, if the bags have some moisture in them. When that pile of mulch hits your driveway, you'll notice within a day or so that pile will start smoking pretty quickly. It goes into compost mode very quickly when it's 90 some degrees outside. So you do have to be careful with it. Frequently, if I'm mulching during the summer and I landscape I'm trying to get paid, so it didn't matter what day it was. We were, you know, of the year, we were trying to work and trying to get things done. Frequently, I would just take the piles of mulch and find, there are not a lot of open spaces in this garden, but if you do have an open space, you can dump the wheelbarrow and then wait for it to cool off a little bit and then rake it out around your plants. But do be super careful putting hot mulch around, especially tender perennials. Your trees and woody trees and shrubs will probably be fine with slightly elevated temperature mulch, but your herbs and ground covers and, you know, herbaceous plants, hosta, things like that, if the mulch is 120, 130 degrees or something, it's not going to be happy that you buried it up to its neck in that. I did open up a week of consultations in July. I talked about last week that I had blocked off consultations, and I just figured out a week there in July where I'm available. So if you're trying to book a consultation over on the website, there is a week in July now that is available. Let's see, number 10. Somebody asked about the dark green strap-like plant with the veining that was in last week's video over here. That's the red vein sorrel. We use a lot of sorrel. I got one right here. We use a lot of sorrel in the landscape, but see how beautiful that red vein sorrel actually is. It's just a beautiful ornamental plant, and so we use, it's obviously edible. The green sorrel will eat. This red vein sorrel we just use for decoration, and it's incredible. It's a perennial out here in the garden, and it's always beautiful. In fact, we can just cut it to the ground, and it'll come back up. The deer deer like it. You know, anything that's a big leafy vegetable like that is going to be on the deer list, right? Somebody has a crazy property full of weeds, eleagnus, roses, brambles, poison ivy. After spraying, how long do you need to wait for replanting? So it depends on what you're spraying. If you're just spraying like, if you're spraying like glyphosate, you know, on the label, you know, you can, you know, generally start working out there in fairly short order after glyphosate, but glyphosate probably won't kill eleagnus. So I don't know what you've sprayed. You probably, if you're spraying something, I'm not recommending anybody spray anything, but I'm just answering a question here. If you're spraying something that kills woody material, like roses and brambles and poison ivy and eleagnus and those kinds of things that will kill it quick, then you just need to read the label on the back. It'll say, if it doesn't have the label on it, you can look up any chemical. You can Google it and find out how long you should be waiting. But some of those are probably, you know, 2 months, 3 months. You know, and you got to be careful with poison ivy because it can stay. You know, those oils are persistent. You know, I knew someone who was out working in the garden and, you know, had gotten poison ivy on their gloves, and then, you know, put the gloves on, you know, put the gloves away and then wore them later and then got poison ivy on their face months and months later. So that oil is persistent even after spraying. So just be careful working in it afterwards regardless, but completely depends on the chemistry that you're using to spray as to how long before you can start planting woody plants back in this space. But, you know, it can be from 7 days to months. With some of the new chemistry, it really last a long time, so that farmers can spray along fences and things like that, like once or twice a season, and they very much linger in the environment. New planting of Alyssium looks tough. Old growth has spots and is tired, off-colored. And it was Florida Sunshine Alyssium that looks bad. And it's a lot of horizontal growth. And I've got this horizontal growth on this one as well, down at the bottom. I've got some vertical growth on it and I have some horizontal growth down at the bottom. I see that a lot in these. Just prune that horizontal growth off. You'll eventually get some growth coming up on the top. Keep in mind that some of these chartreuse plants, and I was talking about it with Tom at Maple Walk, that plant burns in the winter time. It's interesting, a lot of the chartreuse plants bleach during the summertime. The sun is directly on them and it bleaches them. But I've noticed on Florida Sunshine Alyssium, it actually does its bleaching in the winter. The winter sun is what causes a problem on it. And so every single spring, ours has a bit of a sickly look to it, where it's been bleached a bit, but then the new growth is quickly covering it up. And some of that old growth is now falling off. So it seems normal, especially if they're out in a lot of winter sun. So where that thing is in a very shady space, this oak loses its leaves in the winter time and everything back there. So it's actually in the sun in the winter. And that's when it's becoming off-colored. Let's see, you can choose to move them into a shadier space in the winter if it continues to do it in future winters. I just don't care. I've got plenty of other things going on out here that the 3 weeks or 4 weeks that thing looks bad is not that big of a deal to me. Somebody got a patio installed and they've got crush and run that's sticking way out from the edge of the patio. So the patio was installed and they put the base down way wider than the actual patio ended up being. Should they get rid of some of it or simply incorporate it into the amended soil? I think you could incorporate a little bit of it, but I wouldn't want to incorporate a whole lot of it because the pH may be pretty high on that crushed gravel. I don't know what the pH of it is, so it could have potentially have some negative impact on the plants that you're planting in and around rock surfaces and concrete surfaces and things where, you know, lime is potentially present. So I would get rid of some of it. I think also just digging in it is not fun. It's not fun to dig and crush and run, but I would definitely get rid of some of it at least. So somebody has columnar apples. They had a heavy frost and it killed the flowers and the young leaves. Will it re-leaf out or is it kaput? It depends on I don't know. I mean, by the time I'm answering this question, it probably should have already started to leaf back out. I know people have had some very late frost in parts of the country this year. We have somehow avoided having a frost in months and months. I don't know when the last frost we had, probably 2 months ago. Yeah, probably close to 2 months ago at this point. Most likely they'll leaf back out. It just depends on how old they were. Really, that's part of it. Anytime a plant's taking damage, you know, it becomes a thing of how healthy were they, how old were they already under some other types of stress, that kind of thing. But most 90% of plants or 95% of plants just immediately just leaf right back out. Obviously, your flowers are gone for this season. Let's see. So somebody has a Viburnum opulus roseum, and they planted it in the summer of 22, bloomed in the spring of 23. It's in only about 3 hours of sun, and it's got no blooms this year. Why didn't it bloom? So hard for me to answer these questions, but that may not be enough sunlight for that viburnum to actually bloom. They've got a hydrangea paniculata that blooms in that low of light, and then why? Well, it depends on how much light it was getting at the time it needed light. You know, keep in mind, I call it viburnum season, which is pretty much just passing. You know, almost all of the viburnum we have in the garden here. I've got Davidii, Macrocephalum, Viburnum nudum. I've got a hummingbird on the salvia over here. All of the viburnums here have finished blooming at this point, and the hydrangeas are just starting. So the sunlight could be different for that different time of the season. The sun may be up on a better angle when those hydrangea paniculata are going to bloom, which is basically almost months apart between that viburnum and a paniculata. My hydrangea paniculatas are showing no signs of blooming yet. My macrophyllus have started, but Viburnum opulus blooms way back in March for us. So there's a big window in between, and the sunlight differences could be very different during that period of time. It's also possible that you got a hard freeze on it, as that was about to happen as well. I don't know. I'm guessing at these questions, but 3 hours of sun may not be enough for that particular viburnum to be really happy. So somebody said, if we do a closed loop garden, will we still import annuals and will collect the seed on our own? Yeah, it depends on, I guess there's varying degrees of a closed loop garden, right? I mean, you could be like, I'm never going to bring anything else into this garden ever, ever, ever. That's probably unlikely for anyone. You know, you're still going to, you could have a closed loop garden in a different way where you're trading with neighbors and that kind of thing too, you know, where somebody else has collected seed or has plants that you could buy, sell, and trade and still feel like you were in a bit of a closed loop, right? It doesn't have to be necessarily, it's only this 0.19 acres and nothing else. I'll never get another seed or anything off of it. It's just, I want to be as close to as possible, not having to bring things into this garden. And so by using all of these plants, which are now just growing so fast, I can use the materials that I'm cutting off of them to create my own compost and create my own mulch, and the leaves that are falling off of things can create mulch, and they're basically they're taking the nutrients that they used this year and just reusing them right back into the plants the next year. And we would like to collect seed on things. We would like to collect, but I'll probably still buy in some seeds. I mean, a couple of the tomatoes I grow are very complex hybrid seed that requires a professional basically to create, and very high level seed production for that bronze torch tomato. So me collecting the seed out of a bronze torch tomato is not going to give me a bronze torch tomato. So there'll be a couple things we would buy in like that regardless. But yes, I would like to collect more of my own seed out of the garden. There's a lot of times, again, sometimes the YouTube channel has an impact on that, where I'll have my cool season vegetables will still be in the garden. They would just right now be bolting and setting seed out here in the garden. Sometimes I'm pulling them just because they don't necessarily look all that great with my background of my tomatoes and peppers and other things that are growing very quickly. The garden looks much better this year without those things still in there. So I have to come around to that as well, saying, hey, this place is going to look this, you know, if you're collecting seed on things, you have to wait for them to be past peak and not look as good in the garden while you wait for that seed to form. So there has to be, you know, that has to be part of the mental part of it too, right? Is you have to let things go beyond where you would normally let them go in order to collect seed on them. Number 17, someone has a lawn care company and they say every year to lime are there no long-term benefits. I don't know why they're telling you to lime. I mean, is it based on a soil test? Is there some, most grasses do like a neutral pH. So somewhere between 6.5 and 7.2. Let's call it that. That's probably the optimum spot for most ornamental grasses, or not ornamental grasses, but turf grasses. And so if your pH is 4.8, and you're trying to grow, turf in that, then, lime would be temporarily helpful. And I have to say this all the time. When you're talking about liming something, you're not talking about you're going to lime it and then all of a sudden the pH is going to be perfect. But when you do lime something, or let's say you put sulfur down to lower the pH, or you put lime down to raise the pH, at some point you should go back and check that and see what impact it's actually had on your pH. Again, it's still going to be short term, but it can last for a few years, perhaps, before it starts to re-drop or go back up, or whatever it is you were trying to do. So it's absolutely positively, anyone who's telling you to put down a nutrient in your garden other than just some sort of just really basic fertilizer with, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, a small amount of each of those, and maybe some micronutrients in it. Just a very small amount of some organic fertilizer. Anything outside of that is without saying it's based on a soil test, you need this, then that's not something you should do. Because again, I've talked about this in the past. It's if you go too far with anything, how do you get it out? It's easy to put magnesium down. It's easy to put calcium down. It's easy to put phosphorus down. How do you get out? You can't, right? So you have to be careful. It's another thing. I'm going to bring this video back up that I put about improving our soils to the point where our plants are producing enough sugars to deter insects. This is a video that went up on the Learn to Garden video series this week. One of the other things in that video is, there's this relationship that this plant has where it's basically collecting the sun's energy, producing sugars. Those sugars are feeding the soil life down below it, and in return, that soil life, the mycorrhizal fungi or the beneficial bacteria, are bringing water and nutrients to this plant. This plant sends out a signal it needs phosphorus. That's the thing that those beneficial organisms are doing. You don't need the optimum amount of phosphorus for this. You just need phosphorus in the soil. So when you get a soil test back and you go, I'm 10% low or 15% low in phosphorus. If your soil's working properly, you don't need to add phosphorus. There's phosphorus here. Those things will get it to this plant when it needs it. You don't need the optimum amount of anything. Now, if you have none of something or you're crazy low in something, that's when we think about adding it. But when you start to get into the micromanaging your soil, you're going to potentially make some sort of mistake that that you can't undo. You can't take these nutrients back out of the soil once you put them in. And you definitely shouldn't lime every year unless it's absolutely based on a soil test. And so, I call out anybody out there in the world who's adding things, especially you're getting paid to do it. You have to base it on a soil test. Otherwise, you're just, you're potentially damaging your own client's garden. Let's see. So somebody said, what's the best filler for a flagstone patio? They had gotten 3 contractors with 3 different ideas. They got 3 different quotes, and one of them wanted to put mortar in between so mortar the stones in place. So there'd be mortar in between them. And then somebody said, a fine gravel, which is basically what I'm using here, which is screenings, which is basically the really, really fine gravel that will compact, it's compactable, of compactable size. Or then they were going to use that that compacting sand that folks use, that basically is like a sand that sets in place almost like a mortar when you water it in place. And which one of those is better? I've always used screenings, which is just, again, the fine gravel. I like working with it. I am going to get the occasional weed come up between the cracks in this patio. It is what it is. Obviously, if you're wanting it to be the least amount of maintenance possible, then having it mortared would be the best way. And most of my client work that I did in the past, I did more mortar patios than anything else. And sometimes I just base that on, how much maintenance I think that they would do, and and that kind of thing. I don't, as much as possible though, in my own garden, I don't want a lot of impervious spaces. And so if I mortar this entire patio in place, it means that water can't get in the ground in between these stones at all. So I would prefer to have the least amount of impervious space as possible. So again, that's up to you. The least maintenance is definitely mortared, for sure. If they do a good job with it. That's one of the tricks, is it's easy to, these stones are pretty dry, and they can take the water out of that mortar pretty quick when you're putting them in, and end up with the mortar cracking in them in the future. So I got pretty good at getting the stone wet, moist before we mortared the joints, and they held up much better. Anyway, okay. Can a major rain event negate the effects of lawn fertilizer? Dilute it? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, if it rains heavily after you put down fertilizer. Now, there are some fertilizers that are encapsulated. So if you'll notice, some of them are in like plastic prills. If the prill didn't wash away, then the fertilizer is still there and it's not diluted, because that fertilizer only allows a certain amount out at the time. But any other fertilizer that you use, absolutely. And that's the reason why in Florida there's blackout periods for fertilizing. We're using nitrogen, because during rainy season they don't want that nitrogen washing out of everyone's lawns into the waterways and causing issues with our water system. This nitrogen in these lawns and nitrogen on farm fields across America do significant damage to our fisheries. We use a lot of nitrogen in this country to produce food, pretty lawns, and it can be damaging during wetter times of the year to the environment, as well as having you wasted your money putting it down, and having it wash away. But yes, absolutely, water can wash it away. So somebody planted, they got a live oak in South Carolina, and they're in zone 7A in Tennessee. Should they plant it now or wait until spring? I don't know. I get really hard to answer this question. Your live oak is probably, you definitely want it out of the winter wind over there in zone 7A in Tennessee. That's going to be your biggest issue. We are like right at the very northern part of where live oaks do well, and there's a couple at the Raleigh Farmers Market that are absolutely beautiful in the parking lot at the Raleigh Farmers Market, and I don't know how. There's the windiest place ever. I sold plants there for years, and it sits above the interstate, and just wind whips through there. And somehow those live oaks look great, abused in a parking lot. And then there's one right here about a block from me in someone's front garden. But we're like right at the northern part. And then you'll up to Norfolk on an angle like that, up into East Virginia, you'll see live oaks as well. But we're like right at the northern part of where you'll see a lot of live oaks. So taking one over to zone 7A in Tennessee is, I don't know. And then whether or not to plant it now, obviously the further you plant it away from the first winter, the better. So, for me, I'd get it in the ground now and try to get it established. But keep in mind that the wind in the wintertime is going to be your biggest issue with that, because that oak has its leaves on it even during the wintertime. Okay, so somebody in Angier, North Carolina was told that plants in Japan are great for great plants here, that the latitude is similar. And is this true? And what kind of plants should they look for? Yeah, so we do have a lot of Japanese plants, but we also have a lot of Chinese plants as well that like similar conditions to the mid-Atlantic for sure, where we're not too hot and we're not too cold. You know, it's not as hot as it is down in the Gulf, and it certainly doesn't get cold like it gets up, you know, a little further north in, you know, Connecticut and, you know, areas a little further, Massachusetts, areas further up the coast. So we get rainfall potentially 12 months out of the year, right? So we're not going through extended periods of time without rain. So we do have somewhat similar environments to some of these places in Asia, and the plants match up well, and the acid soils are the, you know, acidic soils are similar, those kinds of things. So yes, we have a lot of Asian plants that we can grow. And of course, they grow all over the United States as well, but particularly right in here, you know, but things like, you know, the things like the Loropetalum and Pittosporum and, you know, tons of other Asian plants that are in this garden. A lot of them are Japanese, and you'll get that, you know, Japonica, Ilex japonica, Camellia japonica. You know, you'll see that in the species name Japonica. You'll frequently see it, or you'll see Chinensis is Chinese, Sinensis is Chinese. You can see that in the species name a lot of times from where it actually came from. The Camellia sasanquas, and just a ton of plants in this garden. Osmanthus fragrans, this is like the national plant of China. If I was gonna, Guihua is the name in Chinese. It's one of the, so a lot of these plants do quite well transporting them over here, as long as they play nice and aren't invasive. There's no reason not to have them in our garden. So none of those plants are seeding anywhere into the environment. We haven't made that mistake though. We brought lots of plants here that do seed out into the world. But yes, there are lots of Asian plants that do quite well, you know, just coming out of the ground there and going directly into the ground here. It's just a similar environment in some cases. But then I say all that, and then I also want to point out there are a lot of native plants in this garden, a lot. I probably should just do a single video or two videos just on the native plants, because I think it probably gets lost in bouncing around from this Asian plant or this European plant, you know, or South African plant or whatever it is. It probably gets lost how many actual native plants there are in this garden. It's a lot, and I highly encourage that. But having non-native, non-invasive plants blended into that is not an issue. At least for me. Okay, let's see. So somebody had Carex. They planted it twice in Zone 5B, Indiana. He improved the soil, really wants Carex. What does he need to do? You want to make sure you're planting them higher. I think at Zone 5, most of the Carex is going to try to die back to the ground. So all of these, you know, Everillo Carex and other Carexes I show on the channel, they're hardy in Zone 5 to 9. But up in Zone 5, typically they're going to get killed to the ground. And when grasses and grass-like plants get killed completely to the ground, they're more vulnerable to wet winters being an issue. So I would make sure you're mounding them up some when you're planting them. And when I see somebody says, I improved the soil, don't overdo the improvement of the soil. I mean, you're in Indiana, you have some of the best soils on the planet Earth, you know, that feed the world. So you probably don't need to do a heck of a lot. Yeah, I'm sure there are places in Indiana that have poor soils, but for a lot of the state of Indiana, you probably have pretty good soil overall. Just make sure you're mounding things up a bit that have issues with drowning in the wintertime. So that, for me, is any kind of ornamental grasses, any plants that are sensitive to winter wet. Make sure you're mounding them up some, and that should help. And then plant them as far away from the fall as you possibly can, so that they're well established before they go into that first potentially wet winter where it goes dormant. For us, the Carexes don't die back to the ground. Some do, but most don't die back to the ground in the wintertime. And they're able to deal with the water a little bit better with foliage on top. Somebody's in St. Louis, Zone 6B. They have two 20-year-old crepe myrtles with 4 leaders in each tree. This past winter, all of the leaders died on one, and the other one, 2 died. So I don't know what was different in the 20 years you've had these crepe myrtles. Obviously, I mean, crepe myrtles we consider Zones 7 to 10, 7 to 9, 7 to 10. with some exceptions. There are some that we know that are a little more cold hardy into zone 6, and a lot of people will grow them in zone 6 as basically perennials, like herbaceous perennials, where they'll let them die down to the ground, or they'll pile hay up around the base of them and let them die just down to the hay or the straw, whatever, and then they'll come back out from that. So there's strategies that you can use to keep them alive, because they're root hardy, they're just not top hardy. So I don't know why, though, after 20 years this happened on these. I don't know if it was colder, maybe it got colder quicker. So I have no idea what actually, but this person, let's see. Well, they wanted to know if it could be scale. No, I don't think scale would have killed them to the ground like that. It's probably definitely, almost certainly, was some sort of winter damage. This person is blind and wanted to be able to communicate some strategy to someone who is helping them out. I think both of them are going to come back from the roots. And I said in last week's video that crepe myrtles typically come back later than other things, just in general. They've started leafing out much earlier than they used to here in Raleigh, but typically they're pretty late. So even the one that had the 4 that got all killed to the ground, they're going to start coming back up. So the strategy that needs to be employed is you're going to get lots of suckers, and you're going to need to pick out which ones that you want to keep. So I would pick 3 or 4 or 5 that are the most vigorous coming back from the ground, and select those as the future tree, basically, and hopefully they don't get killed. The problem is now there's not a lot of wood in that new growth, and they're probably a little more likely to be killed by the ground depending on this next winter going forward. But I think both of them will start coming back from the base. When they take damage on the top, all crepe myrtles will then put lots of energy into making lots of suckers that will come up. You're just going to have, again, just select those down to just a few that you want to keep, and tell the person just to pick 3 vigorous ones or 4 vigorous ones, and make sure they're not heading right toward one another. Pick ones that are on a slight outward angle from the center of the root ball, and that way in the future they don't end up hugging one another and crossing one another as they grow upward. Okay, so somebody said an oak fell in Louisiana, wants a shorter tree, tall enough to shade but not damage if it falls. Something other than a crepe myrtle or a rose of Sharon. We have the Amelanchier out in the front garden, the serviceberry, and that's something you could grow down there. You could down in Louisiana, you could grow a live oak, and the live oaks are pretty tough plants, unlikely to fall if you've planted one. If you've planted it in open space and it just has on its own grows in that space. I mean, they're the oldest live oak in the country is the Seven Sisters oak, which is in Louisiana, just north of Lake Pontchartrain there, and it's in a private garden, which is kind of wild, but it's older than America, and it's just, so live oaks are probably a pretty good choice for you. The other thing about it is, I hate to say these kinds of things, but sometimes I do. If you plant an oak or a large growing shade tree back into that space, it's probably not going to get big enough to fall on the house while you're there. That's just the way it is, right? The giant oaks that are in this neighborhood that are 85 or 90 years old were planted by people, that have long passed, and they're, wasn't a problem for them, right? I hate to point that out, but you also can plant the shade tree a little further from your house, and somebody else had kind of chimed in with that. They're Amelanchier or, again, a live oak would work in that space, and it takes live oaks hundreds of years to become big enough to be an issue. Okay, last question for this week, and again, the $60 off the Learn to Garden video series over on the website is good for, as you're watching this video, another 9-10 days, something like that. And there's going to be, Steph is going to be doing design videos coming up on that as well. I'm hoping to get both of those up before the end of May, so there'll be 4 new videos during the $60 discount on that. And I did open up a few more consultation spots over on the website for July. I talked earlier in the video about over-fertilizing things and, the push of fertilizer, and it's just so amazing to me. And I tell you what, there's a lot of things being pushed. I mean, there's just you know, I try to push. I mean, I'm pushing. You know, if I'm selling you something, I'm selling you something. You know, like the Learn to Garden video series or the weekly garden planner, something that I hope is going to be helpful to you in gardening and actually overall save you money, because I'm telling you all the things you shouldn't be buying. But more and more, you know, I just see the push of, you know, selling people raised beds and selling people, you know, all kinds of things, and fertilizer being, you know, right at the top of the list. You know, dig a hole and let me dump all this fertilizer into the bottom of this hole, you know, at the beginning of this video so that I can show off a bag of fertilizer. You know, most everybody watching doesn't need any of those. A lot of the things that people are trying to sell them, you know, it's just, you just don't. And so that's a big part of this channel. But anyway, the last question here, they fertilized a new hydrangea macrophylla and they overdid it, and it burned the plant. If you get nitrogen, you know, if you overdo nitrogen especially, you'll see burning on the edge, you know, the outer edges of the leaves, and it can show up in some other ways as well, but it's pretty easy to do. Now it only has lots of new green leaves, you know, which is the other thing. If you start pushing it, you know, with synthetic fertilizers, you get lots of green leaves a lot of times and not a lot of flowers when you push something with nitrogen. And then she said, can she save it? It'll work itself out on its own. It may not bloom the best it's going to bloom this year after damaging it with fertilizer, but typically woody shrubs and trees can handle, they're more likely to be able to handle us making some sort of mistake, right? Planting it at the wrong time of day, you know, pruning it at the wrong time of year, over fertilizing it, under watering it. You know, these woody plants are just more likely to hold up from that. It's our annuals and herbaceous perennials that, you know, sometimes you only get one shot, you know, if you damage them, you know, you over fertilize your dahlias or over fertilize something else like that. If it gets burned up, sometimes they don't necessarily come back as well. So, you know, but your woody plants like that, and over the course of the year, that growth will settle out. Hopefully it'll reset buds for next year and bloom normally. But I just use a small amount of organic fertilizer on it in the late winter, or nothing. You know, I talk frequently. If your plants are growing and looking like they're performing well on their own, they don't need any fertilizer. I use fertilizer for me outside of that one video that I make a year. The rest of the year, I'm completely and totally basing fertilizer requirements on, you know, need. And so if we go slowly around to here, let me see how low this is. We'll lower it just a bit. Okay, you can see the edge of the patio here. These salvia that we planted in a video several weeks ago have already doubled in height. The gomphrena that went in front of it in another video, just plugged in some gomphrena, it's already blooming. I'm gonna take the blooms off of these so that they fill out some. But this was just a little bit of compost added to this bed. And again, it got that general throw in a little bit of fertilizer out back in February. This salvia is already 3 feet tall. The bee balm back here is growing like crazy around that butterfly house. Everything is growing. Everything is looking like it's supposed to look out here. It's got the good rich green color. Nothing has leaves where they look off colored or they're, you know, so why would I need to fertilize? I mean, there's no reason to fertilize them if they're growing like they're supposed to be growing. So that's one of the things I just kind of want to get out there into the world, is that just because there's 700 fertilizers in a store doesn't mean you need any of them. If things are growing well, slow and steady wins the race. So there you go. There is the garden question and answer video for this week. Again, you can ask gardening questions down in the comment section below, and that's where we pick from. And thanks for following along.